This is gonna be a trip. It is so warm out right now. And of course I'm under the recording blanket, so oh my goodness. I knew that I'd be talking about Going Under at some point. It's a game that just hit me way too hard. And despite the general feeling that it probably didn't perform as well as it should have in terms of sales, I also feel like plenty of people have talked about it already, especially on YouTube. Yakko's video, which I've mentioned previously, does a good job of covering both story and gameplay with his typically slick and poppy editing, and other folks have discussed the game's clear anti-capitalist leanings. And despite all that, despite the 3 or 4 times I've failed to write a script for this exact video, I still feel motivated to talk about the game, not so much to critique or analyze the specifics of how it's made or how it plays, but as a way of talking about severely unhealthy work environments, especially among tech startups. And this is hopefully an area where I can share something a bit different from those other videos I mentioned, because I have a whole lot of experience working with startups. In fact, I'm still technically working for one right now, but in the past I worked for this one tech startup, the name of which I definitely can't mention because I'm going to say some extremely negative things about the experience, and the company has a history of taking harsh legal action to protect itself. And even more importantly, a lot of the workplace issues depicted or alluded to in Going Under aren't really specific to startups at all. These are problems that are depressingly common just in working life. And while they're not new, they're still worth talking about because I haven't really seen or even heard of any real improvements in a lot of these areas. These are persistent problems that just haven't been solved. Going Under manages to talk about this stuff in ways that feel authentic and also just plain funny. Part of this video is about pointing out how well done it all is, but from there I would like to move on to a broader discussion of why this stuff matters, both the problems themselves and talking about them. Obviously, the video will get into some unpleasant subject matter, but I will also do my best to keep things pretty light, or at least relatively so. Going Under, after all, is a funny game, and in general, certain aspects of bad jobs are funny too, especially after you've gotten a different job. Okay, a very quick rundown of Going Under. It's a roguelite action game where you play an unpaid intern working for a startup called Fizzle, which, despite its underdog branding, is actually a subsidiary of a massive corporation that's clearly a stand-in for, well, any of the major corporations you can think of, probably Amazon in particular. The combat takes place in the underground former offices of previous subsidiaries that have gone under, both literally and figuratively, and now the employees, managers, etc. of those companies have turned into monsters themed around the toxic workplace culture that led to each company's ruin. It's hard to think of other games that have better ludonarrative cohesion than Going Under. In other words, the gameplay and the story/subject matter mesh extremely well, and it definitely feels like this cohesion was a major priority during development. Like many other roguelikes and roguelites, the gameplay is fairly repetitive and also pretty difficult. In this context, that makes a lot of sense. It's a job, a bad job, and you're meant to feel like you're grinding. One of the most prominent tracks in the score is even called The Grind. After a loss or a victory in one of the dungeons, you can chat with your coworkers and boss, but there's always a sense of separation between you and them. They're full employees, they actually get paid, and they don't have to do any of the life-threatening dirty work that you do. But we start to notice some of the problems through these characters. Each of these characters is representative of some key workplace problems, or at least a lot of them are, especially problems that seem to be more common in startups, or maybe they're just more noticeable in startup environments. The head accountant, Tappy, does her job well, but company leadership dismisses everything she says, and she's also aware that she only got hired so that they'd have an attractive lady around the office. The lead engineer, Kara, is overworked, and her concerns are basically ignored. She's forced to work on the founder's flights of fancy rather than key projects and maintenance. The project manager, Marv, just totally kisses the ass of the founder while being very rough on the employees all while kind of pretending to be the nice guy. In one of the earliest scenes, he coerces the player character, Jackie Fiasco, into killing monsters by threatening to let her go. The saddest part is that this is still a significant threat, even though Jackie's not making any money from the job at all. Then you have Ray, the founder CEO, who, despite bringing a lot of positivity to the table, is extremely impractical, making risky or even dangerous decisions that could destroy the company and put everyone out of work. He also clearly comes from a place of supreme privilege and doesn't seem capable of listening to anyone. Early on, a lot of the workplace friction is just hinted at, but after beating some bosses and triggering more scenes, the underlying issues get a lot darker than you might expect from such a colorful and funny game. And before we really head into the deep dark depths, I want to talk some more about the humor. It's almost hard to communicate just how funny the game is, and recommending comedy also comes with the risk of someone checking it out and going, yeah, you know what, it's not really for me. But when I've shown anyone Going Under in real life, the humor is clicked like right away. And not only is it successful basically all of the time, but it's also varied. You've got the references to pop culture, which are usually pretty innocuous and fun. Then you have the tech bro jokes about meal replacement beverages and monorails and crypto mining. And then you have my favorite kind of jokes, the ones about having no money. And it's worth lingering on that last bit because I recently mentioned in my video on season 3 of Close Enough that a lot of media about being broke doesn't feel especially true to life, probably because the people who are in a position to make mainstream media about not having money are currently making boatloads of money, or at the very least, a living wage. So there's this disconnect, and this is something that we talk about a lot these days in other situations. People shouldn't try to tell a story that isn't theirs, that they don't have personal experience with. A white guy shouldn't be writing a highly personal tale about the real world struggles of a black woman, for example. A born and bred British national shouldn't be creating the definitive work on the immigrant experience. At the very least, you should consult with people who have had these experiences, but so far anyway, no one seems to take issue with, I don't know, a team of creatives at AOL, Time Warner, PepsiCo, Viacom, Halliburton, Skynet, Toyota, Trader Joe's, trying to make cartoons about a lower class family who can't pay their bills. There's room for discussion on the point, but at least for me, as someone who came from a comfortable middle class background and who has been for the whole of their adult life so far very solidly low income, it's pretty easy to tell whether specific writers know what they're talking about on this front. And in Going Under, I completely believe all of the content related to being broke during young adulthood. I'm gonna spoil a couple of jokes here real quick, so skip ahead a bit if you'd rather discover them for yourself. A little ways into the game, you can equip mentors, each of whom has a special perk, or gives you a special perk during dungeon runs. Because Tappy relates to your situation of being an unpaid worker, she tells you about one of her hot tips for making some extra money, which is scrounging around on the floor for loose change. So during runs, you'll collect little piddly amounts of money that gets added to your currency count, but the shop items are so expensive that this extra cash makes basically no difference at all. Meanwhile, Ray has gone bankrupt multiple times and continues to borrow money, so his mentor ability gives you a credit card to use in the shops, and when you spend more than what you actually have, this happens. But on the plus side, all of this stuff is really closely tied to gameplay, but the devs also aren't afraid to just kind of mess around with the player a bit for the sake of a joke, kind of like the stuff I've mentioned right here. And at least for me, it works perfectly. I might have gotten my hopes up that a particular dungeon run would be a bit easier thanks to one of these perks, but instead the rug gets pulled out and I just start laughing. And that's another totally valid way to keep me playing. It's just another kind of motivator. But of course, the aspect of the storytelling where I feel the most intense sense of relatability is the workplace satire and a seeming general attack on bad jobs. And yeah, that means that it's time to get into the weeds. I've had some bad jobs. I've had some very bad jobs, in fact. And, well, I think there's value in people talking about their bad jobs, which is what I'm about to do here. I also understand that, one, they can be depressing to hear about, and two, even some very bad jobs still come with a certain amount of privilege. For example, I've never had to work an illegal job. Mostly. Not really. Not for very long anyway. Let's move past that. Also, I'm a white guy, so there's tons of privilege there too, obviously. I've never been sexually harassed at work, for example. Now that I'm thinking about it, that is also not true. But still, I haven't been discriminated against for really any reason in the workplace, especially not my race or gender. And I'm not trying to speak on behalf of other people who have had really, truly terrible workplace experiences like that. I'm just going to talk about some of the stuff that I've experienced personally or that I've witnessed personally, and obviously I will not be sharing the names of any companies or individuals, though if you know me in real life, if you're one of those 10 people, then you'll absolutely know which job I am talking about. And of course, a lot of what I want to cover here is represented in some form in Going Under, hence connecting that game to this whole video. Specifically, I'd like to talk about a period of about 2 years when I was working for a tech startup that was still pretty small at the time. I think there were about 30 to 40 people there total, and most of us weren't actually employees, but independent contractors. And I honestly don't know if the independent contractor status is like a thing in other countries. A lot of European countries, for example, tend to have slightly better like worker rights and protection and stuff, so I have no idea. But just in case, I think I should explain the basics of this concept because it's pretty confusing even for people who are contractors. So being an independent contractor is supposed to mean that you've agreed to work for a company for like a set amount of time, let's say 6 months or something, and you agree to this via a contract that lists out all the details. Contractors are not held to all the same requirements as employees. They might have a say in their work schedule, for example. They might not have to attend certain meetings, trainings, etc. But on the flip side of that, the company isn't legally required to provide the same things to contractors that they would to employees. So they aren't required to provide benefits, though some do anyway, and they might not provide contractors with all the same resources and perks that employees get. Workplace injuries are a big thing here too. If you get injured at work, a company might not be required to pay out workers' comp or do anything for you that they would do for full employees. By the way, I also previously worked at a private investigator's office, which is a different story, but most of our cases there were related to workers' comp, and I've seen firsthand just how far a company will go to not have to pay out workers' comp and get the whole thing thrown out. It's pretty disgusting. Anyway, in the case of this job, the independent contractor status was kind of meaningless. We didn't really have any extra scheduling flexibility, as far as I know. We didn't agree to set working periods. We just had to show up at work for every shift, every day, just like employees, albeit for much worse time slots. So when I was there, my shift was Saturday through Wednesday, 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. with a 30-minute unpaid lunch break. I did notice that the company was very aware of its optics. They rented office space in a big fancy skyscraper, and the main office space gave off a really good impression to visitors as well as prospective employees, contractors. But the separate office space where I worked was basically empty and like cheap and ugly. They had a bunch of the cheapest desks you could buy from Amazon, as well as a bunch of the cheapest office chairs you could buy on Amazon, as well as a bunch of the cheapest laptops you could buy on Amazon. And that was about it. It mostly just felt like a warehouse. The company's workload was growing fast, which meant that they had to keep hiring contractors. It also didn't help that people were quitting or getting fired more or less constantly. And when turnover is high and the work is relatively unskilled and there are always more applicants waiting in the wings to work at what they think is some hip startup, the workforce remains completely replaceable. And a replacement irreplaceable workforce doesn't have any power. Individuals have the power to leave, I guess, but then that means they're immediately putting their financial well-being at risk, and their departure will have had no significant impact. By the way, less than 6 months after I quit the company, my entire department was outsourced to the Philippines, which put roughly 60 people out of work, and obviously they were hiring in the Philippines so they could pay people less. Very cool move. Jesus Christ, what a bunch of... So there were actually some minor positives to this job, very surface level stuff. A lot of those just felt like obligatory nods to the public reputation of startups. So they fed us lunch. There were snacks around all the time. I guess that's about it for like the perks. And again, these are the kinds of perks that probably look really good to someone looking for a job, or maybe to a potential investor who's in the building for a visit. But what outsiders didn't see were the many serious issues that were present for the entirety of my time there. Probably the biggest issue of all was the lack of leadership, or outright bad leadership. This is absolutely something that Going Under depicts well, mostly via the character of Marv, with Ray thrown into, but Marv is much more active there in terms of bad leadership. To me, Marv embodies a particular type of really bad middle manager that I think is somewhat common. These managers are a step above the entry-level employees, and so they often feel some sense of superiority, but they ultimately function as executors of the decisions made by the higher-ups. They have goals they need to accomplish, quotas they need to meet, and in the process of trying to achieve those goals, they might do some things that harm their relationships with the employees under their leadership, and even harm the well-being of the workplace in general. Obviously, harassment, discrimination, and emotional abuse coming from a workplace leader are completely inexcusable, and not to mention illegal, but I have a bit more sympathy for managers who make less serious mistakes simply because they don't know what they're doing. Either they're not well suited to a leadership role, or they just haven't been trained properly, or even trained at all. And that was definitely the case in our office. People got promoted for all kinds of reasons, and only some of those reasons were valid. Someone might become a manager by showing themselves to be sort of cool and confident under pressure, and someone might become a manager by being a personal friend of the person making the promotion. In fact, have you ever heard of the Peter principle? Basically, it describes a professional situation where a person gets promoted so much and so quickly that they're just not qualified for their new role. That was more or less our situation. And when you have a bunch of unqualified people in leadership positions, things start to break down. In our case, the workplace became extremely tense. Office politics were rampant, cliques formed, and especially given the average age of company employees, contractors, it really did just end up feeling like high school. For a lot of us, it was just miserable working there, and the work itself wasn't even really the problem. It was everything around the work. It was communication between departments and individuals, petty gripes, arguments, and tone-deaf orders from the C-suite that just felt completely detached. And to cope with the situation and the general feel in the office, like, people were doing some stuff. People were turning to substances quite a bit. Some people were just straight up stealing things from the office because they had no respect for anybody, the leadership, other contractors, whatever. They just hated the whole thing. We're trying to profit from it in another way. Like, it was bad. And going back to that idea of like the orders from the higher ups feeling very detached from the reality of our working situation, I honestly just think that came from the fact that leadership, high level leadership, not like managers and stuff, but the executives, they were detached. The founders of the company, who were still running the company, would only show up like every so often, but most of the time they just weren't around. And in fact, there was a time where we got this company-wide email blast about how the startup had just received in the neighborhood of $80 million in venture capitalist funding. I'm not sure why they felt the need to announce this to us, because all it did was get our hopes up that we might be getting a nice bonus or maybe like a permanent raise, but nope. That was the end of it. Though I did hear shortly after that one of the founders had just purchased a house in Beverly Hills, and I don't think that exactly boosted morale. Overall, it was just an oppressive atmosphere. Personally, I did not feel valued. I dreaded coming into work every day, and if I ever voiced concerns or opinions on how things were being done, how people were being treated, I was just ignored. I'm sure plenty of you out there have been in similar situations, so you know just how awful that feels to be completely dismissed. You just don't have any real recourse. I'm probably going on about the details a bit too much, but one of the most memorable moments was towards the end of my tenure at this company. I was in the hallway one day and I noticed just a literal hole in the wall, like a hole in the drywall. And I asked a friend about it there, and they said, "Oh yeah, so-and-so just punched a hole in the wall this morning." But what was even more concerning was how no one really even batted an eye. It's not that all of us would have done the same thing, but we definitely understood why someone would want to punch a hole in the wall. Even after I left, I ended up receiving a settlement payout from a lawsuit that a former employee, contractor, had filed against the company. And that was far, far from the only legal discrepancy the company perpetrated. Some of those discrepancies have even been covered in the mainstream press, but again, not naming names. And here's why I think it's important to talk about serious workplace issues, because when I was still working this god-awful job, and even for a long time after I left, I just internalized everything and wrote a lot of it off. I thought that I must just be bad in work environments, or that all of these problems were specific to this company and its terrible leadership. And it took time to realize just how common these problems were, especially among startups. One piece I'd like to highlight is a New Yorker article titled 4 Years in Startups by Anna Wiener, however it's pronounced. It details her journey with and perception of startups and startup culture. She slowly realized just how awful and exploitative a lot of these companies could be while working at them in the heart of Silicon Valley, and how most of them operated on this assumption that they would reach massive success despite the odds being very much against them. It's a really great read, and I can't really do it justice here, but coming across this piece was honestly one of the first times that I got a look into how widespread these issues are. I think with startups in particular, it's especially surprising to people to hear about some of this, because the wider cultural branding of startups paints a very different picture. For years, the term has been associated with progressive workspaces that prioritize employee well-being. They're hip, they've got money to burn, and they're run by kid geniuses. They're all about innovation and disruption and independence. But in reality, only a small percentage of startups really seem to actually enact progressive ideas and structures. And as for independence, the ultimate dream for most startup founders is to make the company enticing enough to attract an acquisition by one of the already massive tech companies, which will make them richer than God, of course, and they'll never have to work again if they don't want to. Sometimes startups treat their employees and contractors well, but I have to imagine that ultimately that's still a pretty small number compared to the total. When revenue and the personal wealth of executives and founders is the primary goal, there are always going to be sacrifices made in other areas. And in my experience, companies often end up mistreating people in ways that either aren't technically illegal, or maybe they'll even do something blatantly illegal because they assume that the people they're exploiting can't or won't fight back. On multiple occasions, that former company I worked for straight up paid specific people off to keep quiet about something that was legally dubious at best. The reality of startups is so far from the image that most people probably have, and I think it's important to remember that even the term startup is just a savvy rebranding of the word company. These are companies. This isn't new. And this is where I can briefly touch on how a lot of the workplace problems that I've covered here, as well as many of the problems covered in Going Under, aren't actually specific to startups at all. Again, I just think they've attracted a bit more attention in relation to startups because the general public doesn't expect this kind of thing from these young, supposedly hip companies. Following dozens of other stories of worker exploitation in the video game industry, for example, we've just recently gotten a story about how contractors at Nintendo were being treated like second-class employees by the company. And I mean, hey, Nintendo is by no means a startup of any kind. They're not a small business. They are an institution that's been around for decades. And even so, this kind of garbage that they're doing is extremely similar to what we're seeing from small game studios and startups in general. Just because a company is small doesn't mean that it's innocent and innovative. And just because a company is established and traditional doesn't mean that their glaring mistakes aren't worth pointing out. And I think it's for that reason that I feel Going Under is a kind of gateway to much larger discussions about the nature of work and the distribution of wealth and power, which are essentially one and the same, at least here in the US. Going Under is friendly, fun, accessible, funny, and generally kind. It's an excellent way to get a sense for a lot of common workplace problems, including some that you may not have experienced firsthand. From there, people who want to learn more and delve a bit deeper can move on to more complex, challenging work on the subject. I'm not trying to speak for the devs of Going Under, obviously, but I do think the game just plain does a lot of work in this area. It's not just a fun toy to mess around with. There's substance behind the lighter elements, and it encourages the player to engage with this stuff. Not a lot of games are able to do that. And I'm not saying that every game has to do all of that either, but at least for me, that extra layer goes a long way toward making Going Under one of my all-time favorites. Also, it goes on sale for like next to nothing, so maybe you should just buy it. Well, that's all the big stuff, but before I finish up, I wanted to draw a comparison to another video I put out recently. This might get slightly melodramatic, but I'm feeling it, so let's just do it. In my video on the integration of advertising in just about every streaming service, I talked about how at one point it felt like streaming services were poised to do and to offer something genuinely new, that they might actually restructure the landscape of entertainment. But at the moment, it really doesn't feel like they will. It just feels like they're rushing to reassemble old structures. And that's really depressing to me. There was an opportunity, but it just sort of died off. The quote I put in the thumbnail for that video is from Thomas Pynchon, and we could say a lot about the over-worship of Pynchon by literary fanboys, but that's a different topic. But you know what? The guy can sure string some words together. He knows what he's doing. And I really like this quote. It's from Inherent Vice, and it's about the history and trajectory of the United States and how at one point there was a real opportunity for the experiment to create something new and beautiful. But along the way, something went wrong. Maybe there were too many people only looking out for themselves. Maybe the most miserable crimes of its history were too much to move past. Or maybe it was just fated to happen on some level. But it's also not a permanent condition to just sit around and feel bad about. When things go south, when situations are bad, there's always room for change, even when it comes to those big, giant structures that we all live in. And in my opinion, criticizing is an important part of the process. We, as people, don't criticize things just to be or because we like feeling self-righteous. It's because we want things to be better, and that's not something to be ashamed of.